Hi, my name is Samuel Morris and this is Elementary English. Welcome. Today we're going to identify and classify narrative texts using a variety of ways. So the nature of narrative and how to read them, as well as drawing conclusions from a narrative, all revolves around understanding what a narrative is, and it's quite simple. So a narrative is a story. A narrative is essentially ideas and events that all follow a storyline or a plot. This storyline looks kind of like a roller coaster when we map it out, from beginning, middle to end, and as we have action that's, well, not so much at the beginning, quite a bit towards we get to the middle and end, and it trails off as well. So this story or plot map is going to help us understand narratives, how they're told, and how we can draw conclusions and understand the nature of those narratives a little bit better. To start, there are a few different types of narratives or stories, and you're probably familiar with all of them. The most popular and common type of narrative is a linear or a viewpoint narrative. This narrative is a story that tells itself from a single viewpoint, and it's linear. It goes in a single line from beginning to middle to end. Another type of narrative is, well, non-linear. And you guessed it, non-linear does not go exactly in order. We're going to feature things like flashbacks and maybe dreams or visions into the future. That one's going to be a little bit trickier, but it's still a story that follows that plot map nonetheless. The last type of narrative is the quest narrative. This can be told from a variety of different viewpoints, but they all center around a common quest or goal. And this is very popular in Disney movies and in family-style stories that are traditional and generational as well. So now that we have an understanding of what a narrative is and the plot map in which it follows, let's look at a few examples. And as we look at these examples, I'll ask you, is this a narrative or not? Our first example comes from C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in the Chronicles of Narnia. The first page sounds like this. Once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station and 2 miles from the nearest post office. He had no wife, and he lived in a very large house with a housekeeper called Miss McReady and 3 servants. We're going to pause right there. See, right off the bat, when we read a story like that, well, we know that it's a story or a narrative, right? Something in us reminds us that, well, it sounds like I'm listening to a story. So the first clue of knowing whether something is a narrative or not is your own gut. Does it feel like a story? Most often, you're going to be right. Another tool we can use is that plot map, right? The story map. And in The Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe, we get the beginning right away of that plot map. It tells us the characters, what they're doing, where they are, why they're there, in just one single page. So that is a telltale sign that this narrative text is in fact a narrative. Now let's think of another example. Let's say that you get a message that says, "This is your appointment reminder. You're going to see Dr. Flores for your dentist appointment tomorrow at 3 p.m. Text yes to confirm." Does that feel like a story? No. While granted, it's very important information, it's not a story. So it's not a narrative. It doesn't follow the beginning, middle, and end, and the rising action and falling action. It's merely informational, although important information. Now, let's think of a movie that we've seen recently. Just go ahead and think of a movie you've seen in the past 6 months. You're probably thinking of some scenes that have action in them. Maybe not an action movie, but at least one character talking to another. So that is a narrative, because, well, primarily it feels like a story, and also we have that rising action, we have dialogue, we have all of these elements that make a story a story. So for our last example today, I'm going to read the first page of one of my favorite books, and I'm going to ask you whether you think it's a narrative or not. And also, I'm going to ask you to prove it. So as I read this, pay real close attention to the details and how you could prove whether this is a narrative or not. Aguascalientes, Mexico, 1924. "Our land is alive, Esperanza," said Papa, taking her small hand as they walked through the gentle slopes of the vineyard. Leafy green vines draped the arbors and the grapes were ready to drop. Esperanza was 6 years old and loved to walk with her papa through the winding rows, gazing up at him and watching his eyes dance with love for the land. "This whole valley breathes and lives," he said, sweeping his arm towards the distant mountains that guarded them. "It gives us the grapes, and then they welcome us." He gently touched a wild tendril that reached into the row as if it had been waiting to shake his hand. He picked up a handful of earth and studied it. "Did you know that when you lie down on the land, you can feel it breathe? That you can feel its heart beating?" "Papi, I want to feel it," she said. "Come," and they walked to the end of the row. So in that first page, in just that first page, you're pulled into this story. You're pulled into this story that, well, I gave it away. This story, right? It is a narrative because it features characters, dialogue, this rising and falling action. And you have the opportunity to understand and communicate this as well. So today's lesson has been about identifying narratives and stories because it's a really important skill when we're given a text in English class, or we find something online, or we read anything to know whether it's information that we can trust and it's true, or whether it's a story that very well could be true, but oftentimes is for our own entertainment. So as we think about stories and what makes stories stories, I want you to play narrative or not, just like we did today in your own home. So go and find any sort of writing. It could be something that came in the mail, it could be something from a bookshelf or from the basement even. Find any piece of writing and ask yourself, is this a narrative or not, and why? It has been a pleasure having you here this morning to learn about narratives and how to dissect them and identify them among other types of text. Join us next week as we take a deeper dive into narratives, into stories, and look at important story elements like point of view, perspective, theme, and much more. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Samuel Morris, and this has been Elementary English. We'll see you soon.